Hello and welcome. I go by Android and this is my video on why Final Fantasy XIV isn't a World of Warcraft killer and how it potentially has become one anyway. So, this is a bit of a strange video because while I am a person who talk about Final Fantasy XIV versus World of Warcraft, this is more of a video on how players have moved from one game to the other based on my own experiences. So just to sum up my history with World of Warcraft, I most recently stopped in Battle for Azeroth due to being extremely bored, and I played Final Fantasy XIV because of the near raids, only to discover that Final Fantasy XIV is my second favorite game of all time. So, Final Fantasy XIV has never been a game that was meant to compete directly with World of Warcraft. It is a story-focused game. Yes, they're both MMOs, but just because two games share a genre doesn't mean they're in direct competition. It is the same as saying that Overwatch is a direct competitor for Counter-Strike. Yes, they share designs, but the games appeal to different people. So, this is a story on how Final Fantasy XIV became a World of Warcraft competitor without even trying to encroach on World of Warcraft's design space. Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers, the current expansion, was a major milestone in the context of the MMO market, because almost everyone was stunned with just how well written the game was. But there was still a major problem with recommending the game, because the base game, A Realm Reborn, was, to put it mildly, a slog and a half. It was a slow paced game. However, a lot of people were starting to talk about the game and what it did right, and these are baby steps for what caused Final Fantasy XIV to begin being a real competitor for World of Warcraft. And these talks would most likely result in an influx of players in the next expansion, what we now know is Endwalker. Because my experience is that when positive talks happen, it most often show growth numbers later. Because people want to see consistency, especially when they buy into a new, long-lasting product like an MMO. So, yes, Endwalker would likely have pulled a new large player base from World of Warcraft if it happens to be as good or better than Shadowbringers. However, during the course of Shadowbringers, 4 big things happened that I really believe changed the course of the MMO genre and birthed the first actual potential World of Warcraft killer. The first thing that happened was patch 5.3 in Final Fantasy XIV. The second thing was that Shadowlands got released. The third thing, 9.1 got delayed. And the fourth thing is FanFest happening. And these 4 things combined changed the MMO. This is my explanation of how it did it. So, a little context for why 5.3 was such a monumental patch. First and foremost, Shadowbringers 5.0 itself had a great story. It was easily comparable to the giants of single-player stories. I'm talking Nier Automata, I'm talking The Witcher, I'm talking Metal Gear here. It was a great story. 5.3, however, was an amazing story. And this is what solidified Final Fantasy XIV as my second favorite game ever. And it is a patch that has made Final Fantasy veterans who have played every Final Fantasy game ever multiple times proclaim that this is the best Final Fantasy story ever written. For those not in the know, every expansion of Final Fantasy XIV has two conclusions. One is in the expansion patch, the 0.0 patch, and one is in the 0.3 patch. And yes, I know this won't be the case in Endwalker, but this is the pattern until now. And the 5.3 conclusion was just unreal in how well written it was. 5.0, easily 10 out of 10 story. Not one of the best 10 out of 10s, but a 10 out of 10. And 5.3 topped that easily, and so much it actually doesn't make much sense at all. So that's the first important thing about 5.3. And the second important thing about 5.3 is that it brought with it an overhaul to A Realm Reborn, the base game. Around 20 to 25 hours of slog and monotony got cut out of the game, and this has made the game a lot more accessible for new players. Remember what I said at the beginning, even if 5.0 was great, it was actually hard to recommend the game because ARR was slow and sluggish. And with this, there was 20 to 25 hours and now gone from the game. You never have to play it. And that means the game is now, while still slow at some points, it is actually paced reasonably. And these two things combined is why 5.3 is such a monumental thing for this story, and why it brought more attention to the game. But again, I don't think this on its own would make Final Fantasy XIV a potential World of Warcraft killer, but it did plant a seed for that possibility. Now the second major thing that really happened was World of Warcraft Shadowlands. It got released, and from what I understand, hearing about the expansion, it was actually good. Ish, at least. It was not the best. It was not amazing, but people seemed to like it, at least well enough. However, I don't think it was good enough to bring back people who had quit World of Warcraft in battle for Azeroth. And I can use myself as anecdotal evidence here. It wasn't enough for me. It didn't look good enough for me to even consider going back to World of Warcraft. So yeah, Shadowlands stopped the bleeding, but it did not heal the wound that Final Fantasy had inflicted. And then the third big thing, the content drought that hit Shadowlands. And what a drought it has been. 8 months only with the expansion patch and the minor patch. And if I remember right, the information on the first patch usually starts dripping in 2 to 3 months after the expansion releases, and 8 months before the next patch is just too much. It is way too much. No matter how much you love a game, having no substantial updates for this amount of time immediately after an expansion is just too much. It works with the last patch of World of Warcraft because you know there's not going to be anything else. You don't have to gear up. You can enjoy other games, or you can play old content. You don't have to prepare for the next patch. You can prepare a bit for the next expansion, but that's not such a hurry. You need to be that. So, the final thing that happened that really is making Final Fantasy XIV into the first real contender for World of Warcraft killer is FanFest. And it was an emotional fanfest, and it really confirmed that Endwalker will be the expansion that concludes 10 years of story and starts a new big arc for the game. This expansion will be monumental, not just for Final Fantasy XIV, but for Final Fantasy as a whole. And if you don't understand why the Endwalker trailer is so hyped and so revered, I want to tell you that in a way that translates. Every expansion in Final Fantasy XIV has its own musical theme, and the Endwalker trailer references the themes of previous expansions in its music. The Endwalker trailer has so many musical and visual references to old expansion that it is impossible not to get excited when you know those references, and you know it's because the story arc will close. So to translate this to World of Warcraft players, imagine that Illidan had his own theme, Arthas had his own theme, and Sylvanas had her own theme. And these were all being referenced both visually and musically in a trailer for World of Warcraft, all the while those characters' storylines were still ongoing and their current story arcs were good. This is what the Endwalker trailer is. So FanFest was a big thing, and it really made people talk. And these are the 4 events that changed the course of the MMO genre a lot, in my opinion. As I mentioned, Final Fantasy is not competing directly with World of Warcraft. It focuses on its own strengths, and those strengths are story, community, and evergreen content. It still tries to give content for the people who are not included in those groups, but rather than cater to them, the game has the confidence to say that it is not for everyone, but those that like it will love it, and those who don't are still accepted, but there's probably other games that might be better for you. And this means that a raid and endgame focused game like World of Warcraft should not have much of an overlap with the 14 player base. Originally my script here said that these are the areas where Blizzard are failing, but as I edited my script, the news broke that legendaries has to be reforged in 9.1 in Shadowlands. And I think it's actually just more correct to say that for every good decision that Blizzard makes, they make at least one equally bad decision for the game. So no, Final Fantasy XIV is not a World of Warcraft killer, because it is not trying to compete with World of Warcraft. It focuses on what it does well, but World of Warcraft is failing. And that has brought a steady stream from World of Warcraft to Final Fantasy that has gradually become a river. And now Square Enix is also realizing this. And if you haven't noticed, they are pushing really hard with advertisement and sponsored streams. And I am willing to bet that when Endwalker releases, they will go even harder. And I don't think 9.1 is big enough and has enough content for World of Warcraft not to get extremely hurt when this happens. Final Fantasy XIV would not be a World of Warcraft killer or even have the potential if Blizzard had handled the pandemic and their release schedule well, and had not. But because Blizzard sat on their asses, didn't plan well, and made bad decisions, Blizzard has handed a gun to Square Enix, and now we just have to see if it is loaded, and if it is, how many bullets are in the gun. And my bet is more than enough. Thanks for watching. You know the deal. Like, comment, subscribe.